Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. Today, I'm joined by Mohsen Mosleh, Professor Mohsen Mosleh. Professor, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm honored to have you here, and I'm wondering that, your trajectory, something that I really look up to. What initially drew you to study misinformation and social media dynamics?
Sure. So, I'm an engineer by training, and this happened to me back in 2017 when I graduated from my PhD, and I joined a postdoc as a postdoc in the psychology department at Yale University. Me being from technical background, joining a behavioral team, I was looking forward to see what areas I can leverage my technical background to address a pressing issue in today's society. And that coincided with all the stories after the 2016 US election and spread of misinformation and fake news on social media. It was a very natural step for me to work on this question, where I was working on taking the theories that my colleagues from psychology background was working on to the real world and see how we can, find the underlying mechanisms for sharing misinformation, and particularly working on interventions that we can apply in real-world setting on social media to help reduce the spread of misinformation at scale in real-world setting.
And from your work, what I'm interested in something you just mentioned, which is the underlying mechanisms of spreading misinformation. Can you shed a light on what do you mean by this? What are those underlying mechanisms?
Sure. There are various theories about why people share misinformation. And of course, people share misinformation for a variety of reasons. Two main accounts of sharing misinformation. One is more kind of classical reasons for sharing misinformation. That's you do not rely on your analytical thinking, or you do not rely more on your intuition, and that's why you share misinformation, because you do not pay attention to the accuracy of the content you are exposed to. Another account is aligned with the motivated reasoning. That is, when you are leveraging your analytical thinking, you're more likely to share misinformation because that's what is aligned with your political ideology, for instance. In our work, we find more support for the former. That is, majority of people share misinformation basically because they do not pay attention to the accuracy of the content they share. So both in my work and works by my colleague, we looked at this effect. For example, in one study, we combine survey measures with actual social media behavior. So we ran this survey study on 2,000 Twitter users, where we asked them for their demographic information. And we also ran a test called cognitive reflection test, which is a set of questions with compelling, intuitive, but wrong answers. The goal of this set of questions is to measure the extent to which someone relies on their intuition versus analytical thinking. So we gathered this information in a survey study from people, and then we also asked them for their Twitter handle, so we could pull content from their Twitter timeline in terms of accounts they interacted with and the content they shared on Twitter. And then we use a list of domains, where for each domain we have professional fact checkers provide rating of the quality of content people shared. So having this kind of hybrid data set of people cognitive reflection scores, that is the extent to which they rely on their intuitive gut responses versus analytical thinking, and quality of content they shared on actual social media, we were able to examine what kind of cognitive style or thinking processes relates to sharing misinformation. What we found was that we found a positive and significant relationship between the extent to which people rely on their analytical thinking and the quality of content people shared on Twitter in particular. That is, those who rely more on analytical thinking are more likely to share content from mainstream high-quality websites And those who rely less on analytical thinking, those who rely more on intuitive gut responses, are more likely to share content from fake news, hyperpartisan, low-quality websites as rated by professional fact-checkers. And this effect is robust, controlling for a variety of demographic factors, things like political ideology, age, and education, which provides support for the classical reasoning account of why people share misinformation.
Wow. And is it surprising for you that people who share fake news or read more fake news are more intuitive-based thinking? Is that a surprising finding on your research? Was it counterintuitive? Because I think that, for most of us who are on the internet, the internet does appeal to our intuitions, to our gut feelings. It tries to make us a bit raged. So is this the case?
So it's not exactly that like only intuitive thinkers would do that. Even like people who are in normal setting trying to leverage their analytical thinking, when they're on social media, they might be distracted by a variety of factors, like social factors, how many likes my post will get, how many comments people would put on my post. So we might be distracted away from the importance of the accuracy of the content we are interacting with. And that's some design feature of social media, because it distracts us from attending to the accuracy of the content we are exposed to on social media. So people who like on normal circumstances would care about accuracy might be like get distracted. So we did another study where we actually test for the causal effect of this kind of like mechanisms. That is, what we did was that we identified around 5,000 Twitter users who shared low quality, hyperpartisan content on the platform, and then what we did was that we primed them on accuracy. We nudged them towards accuracy. So we helped them to leverage their, cognitive power, and we found that this kind of like a very simple nudge can help people sharing higher quality content. And we did also like a large number of surveys, experiments where we look at people ability to judge true versus false, like their accuracy judgment and also their sharing decisions. And we find a gap between the two. That's like in a large number of circumstances, people are doing a good job in terms of like telling false from true. But if you just ask them, would you share this content? They might end up like sharing like some untruthful content. So what we try to do through this kind of intervention is to bridge the gap between accuracy judgment ability and sharing decisions. That is, people care about accuracy. People do a relatively good job in terms of like identifying accurate content, but when they are making, sharing decisions, they might be distracted by other factors rather than accuracy. So if we can just like nudge people towards accuracy, that can be very helpful in terms of like improving the quality of content they would share on the platform.
And Professor, did you notice when the rising trend of misinformation began? When did we started to being flooded by misinformation, and when did it become sort of difficult to distinguish between truth and misinformation, or rather, when did the balance of sort of truth become flooded in the internet with misinformation? Was it, you mentioned that the 2016 election, was that the breaking point?
So I think that was a point that it brought to many people's attention, but the problem of misinformation has been around for a while, still, since the social media came into play. But I think 2016 was at the point that's like all this political misinformation was brought up to people's attention, and was like a large number of people, start working on that topic. So similar major political events like Brexit, for example, or, during COVID-19, there was like a period of time that it received more attention because like it relates to more kind of like critical issues. Something that I need to mention is that in terms of like the amount of information that is being shared on social media, of course, like if you look at the quality of content, still like these kind of low quality fake news content accounts for like a small portion of social media ecosystem. But something is interesting and is aligned with like prior work is that, for example, this paper in Science back in 2018 by our colleagues at MIT, where they found that, people are more likely to share fake news compared to true news, which, we replicated in a couple of other studies. So the problem here is that, maybe a small portion of the information is completely false, but there is this intention of users who are more likely to share low quality content than true content.
And here a question that I have is, I'm like you say, it's the internet is flooded with misinformation. I mean, it's usually we might have a larger percentage than we think of misinformation, especially on elections. But my question here is that for us users, are we trying to actively look for misinformation? Are we trying to, when we share those ideas, they become viral? So is it the case that the user itself is the one who is to sort of blame for the spread of misinformation?
So, I mean, like I mentioned, there are a variety of reasons for sharing misinformation. That could be one of those. That's like, there is the line of work, like need for chaos, that people like purposefully sharing like bad content. But what we found that is that that's only a small portion of people who would do that. A majority of people wouldn't do that, wouldn't intentionally share misinformation. They just like, share misinformation for other reasons because they think that it's interesting, they think it's funny, they think that would like kind of like, align with whatever their ideology is. But if they are reminded that like, you have to think about accuracy, you need to pay attention whether this content I'm sharing is true, you will see an improvement. So, I mean, of course, there are people who are purposefully sharing those kind of content, like state-backed actors, but that's very a small number of people. A majority of like regular users, they just share it because they don't pay attention. They don't check the content they are sharing is true or false.
And Professor, I'm curious here because, we've touched a bit on elections and those flows of information. What about echo chambers? Because it seems that echo chambers are also, well, a part of your research, but they can also fuel the fire of believing things that are just aligned with our biases. How does this relate with your work in terms of misinformation and social media?
So we have done lots of studies on echo chambers, particularly like focusing on the macro level decision making in terms of like people being like more likely connected to like-minded others. That is, we ran this study where we created like set of accounts with different political ideology, and then we used that to follow users on Twitter, and we look at their probability of reciprocation of social ties given the partisanship. So on Twitter, we found like people are at least 3 times more likely to, reciprocate a social tie with a co-partisan compared to counter-partisan. And even like looking at the rate at which people block other users, we found that people are 12 times more likely to block a counter-partisan compared to a co-partisan. We did another study which kind of like connects this kind of like biases to correction of misinformation. That is where we identified users who shared false content on the platform, and then we create a set of accounts with different political ideology, used them to correct the user and look at the probability of the users being engaged with our content. And that study, we didn't find an effect of co-partisanship. That is, people are similarly more likely to like get engaged with a correction that comes from co-partisan versus counter-partisan. What we found was interesting that having a minimal social connection with the user. That's if you follow the user, like a couple of their tweets, and then you deliver the correction to the user, that could significantly increase the probability of users getting engaged with your corrections.
Wow. And so when we behave in these, when we work, or rather engage in these echo chambers, is it the case that I am more prone to sharing untruth or misinformation or just articles that align with my own political interest versus those that may challenge it within my circle?
So, I mean, part of the, most of the stuff that I talked about so far was about sharing decisions. But the precursor to sharing is basically exposure. So, we are exposed to the content that are available to us through our network. So if I'm, surrounded by many people, like-minded others, but who also like consume and share low-quality content, I am therefore more likely to be exposed to low-quality content. And, a part of why, and we found this like in a couple of different studies, this consistent pattern, for example, with conservatives are more likely to be sharing low-quality content. Part of it is that because they are also like exposed to low-quality content within their network. So in that sense, being in an echo chambers of like low-quality content that are aligned with your political ideology, for instance, can also contribute to sharing of and also consuming lower quality content.
It is becoming increasingly difficult to access truthful, nuanced, and wide-ranging perspectives in terms of the truth we consume and the information we consume. It is increasingly difficult to know what's truth and what's propaganda. Tangle News is an independent, non-partisan politics newsletter. They summarize the best arguments from across the political spectrum on the news of the day, and I've hosted the founder of Tangle News, Isaac Soul, for a conversation on how they engage with their own pieces of information, how they challenge their own ideas, and how does Isaac himself evaluate what's truth and what's not truth, and what to share with their audience. I've always found this newsletter the most balanced and also the most truthful in terms of understanding the political environment we live in and the implications of it for our society. I recommend you to take a look at it with a link in the notes below, and also you can reach out to me or you can reach out to the team so we can put you in contact with Tangle and they can help you set out your account. With that, I'm proud to be partnered with Tangle to share that with you. What strategies, Professor, have you found to be the most effective when combating misinformation online?
So there are a couple of things that are very promising, both in my work and works of my colleagues. One is basically this kind of approach of leveraging people's cognitive ability to reduce the spread of misinformation, which is like a decentralized approach instead of relying on central authority to find what's true and what's false, or use like kind of like algorithmic approach to remove bad content, which has questions of like against freedom of speech and things like that. So one is basically like leveraging individual users' ability to reduce the spread of misinformation, and these kind of like accuracy nudges and large number of individual level interventions or behavioral interventions in that way. Another thing that is very promising is using crowdsourcing approach, for example, for fact checking. Something like, Birdwatch, or now called Community Note on Twitter, where we all leveraging large number of lay people, labeling of content, and then, using kind of like a reasonable crowd approach to provide some feedback on content that receive high engagement on the platform in order to reduce or like identify lower quality and misleading content.
And from a personal perspective on my end, how can I, as a user, be better equipped to identify misinformation?
I think like we as individual users, we first of all we need to pay attention to the content we are sharing. It's like every time we wanted to press a share button on a social media platform, now Facebook, Twitter, like platforms like that, we just need to wait and think for a second whether the content I'm sharing is accurate or not. Am I sure that this content is true or it could be false? And we need to think about the fact that, when we press the share button, it's not only our friends, but our friends of friends and so on might get exposed to that content. Because, our action are amplified by the network within which we are embedded. So it's very important for us, just like don't pay attention, don't be deceived that this content is very funny or like very interesting. We also need to make sure that this content is true.
Professor, how do you see the future of misinformation and truth and social media with the emergence of artificial intelligence?
Sure. I mean, I can see it both as a good thing and like negative thing. We are observing like large number of fake content being generated using like various new technologies, like, large language models, generative models, both in terms of like through propagating like fake content, both through like not only text, but also like videos and, images, which might be more convincing to people. So that's really alarming. But at the same time, we can leverage this kind of technology to fight back. It's like using LLMs, for instance, to deliver fact checks to users. Or there is this recent work by my colleagues at MIT who use LLM to updating people's belief against conspiracy theory, and they found that is much more powerful than just like providing a fixed piece of text to the user, because LLM has this power of like providing lots of facts about the false content or like conspiracy theory, is much more effective in terms of updating users' beliefs. So I think it was like a two end. Like one would be like using this technology by like bad actors, but on the other hand, like platform designers and also researchers in that domain can leverage the power of new technologies to fight back.
It's interesting because it's like you say, it's a double-edged sword. Yeah. And I'm curious to know, how can users themselves, or how has your research or maybe your colleagues found that we can identify what's AI created and what's not AI created?
So, I mean, there is like lots of work being done in that domain. There are training material or like some kind of like providing, short training like quizzes, for example, empowering users to help identify these kind of like false content. For example, like all these images that are generated, for example, by this website, this person does not exist. They have like certain features, like facial features appear in the same place. For instance, there are like edges of images generated by AI, might not very clear. So there are material and like research suggesting that there are certain features you need to pay attention to be able to identify false content, or in particular like false video, like AI generated content. But we need to keep in mind that like this is a very fast moving space, and things or features that we might be paying attention to and being trying to leverage to identify generated AI content, in a year or two from now, AI technology would be able to overcome these kind of like features. So I think it's basically evolving space, but like I mentioned, like this kind of like training material, for example, or like signals could be helpful for the users to identify this false content. Similarly, I mean, platforms are doing that as well. So there are efforts by platforms to label AI-generated content so that the users are informed that this is not a real image, this is an AI-generated content.
And, well, it's very fast-moving, like you say, but up until the moment where we have those markers of AI-driven content, AI-generated content, do you think that it's still healthy from an individual perspective, with your background in psychology, to be exposed to so much potentially artificial, potentially not real information, not real content on the internet? How does that affect on the individual aspect?
I mean, I'm not within my work, but there are research suggesting that, for example, particularly not using social media helps with social well-being. So, spending less time on social media in particular can be more helpful with people's health. This is not something that I'm doing, but there are research in that domain, just not being exposed to so much, fake or irrelevant content can be also helpful for personal or individual overall well-being. Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. We should be more touching grass rather than just touching screens. Professor, is there anything else on your mind that you would like to share with our audience in terms of your work, maybe some of other resources our audience can find in terms of your work or related to all of the topics we've discussed?
Sure. I mean, something that I'm currently working on, which is interesting, I believe, is that so majority of work we have been doing in misinformation and social media in particular has been focused on single social media platforms, in particular Twitter, because of availability of data and access to the data. But something that I'm working on is taking multi-platform approach to the misinformation problem, because since last 2 years when Elon Musk took over Twitter, we saw this migration of users into other platforms Mastodon, Blue Sky, and also alt-tech platform like Truth Social and Gab. So one thing that's important is to see how the findings we have for a single platform generalize to other platforms, which is similar to the multicultural lens in social psychology, where we wanted to see how findings from one culture generalizes to other cultures and how the findings are heterogeneous across different cultures. So that's, I think, is important to see how this misinformation sharing patterns we found in a single platform, in particular major platforms like Facebook and Twitter, would be same or different across different platforms. In particular, there are platforms with very, very low level of moderation. So you can see how that sharing decisions of bad content play out in those kind of platforms. And another thing is also important, because we need to look beyond a single platform, because there could be a good amount of low quality content spills over from one particular platform to others.
And just to speculate a bit here, Professor, what's your theory on these other cross platforms, on these migration to other platforms? Do you think the appearance of misinformation and the spread of misinformation is more or less on other platforms than Twitter or X?
Yeah, I mean, we are looking at this, particularly different metrics of quality of information. So far we have been looking at 8 different platforms, and platforms that do not have any moderation in place, or very low moderation in place, like Truth Social, Gab, and Getter, on average have much more low quality content being shared compared to Twitter, for instance. And still, we at the aggregate level, we can see Twitter, even though lots of low quality content is being shared, on average is a better quality environment than like those kind of like alt tech platform. But the issue with Twitter is that it has like order of magnitude more users, and also like there are important political discourse happening on Twitter compared to other platforms like Gap, Truth Social, and Getter, for instance. And people from both ends of the political spectrum get involved in those kind of discussion, whereas alt tech platforms are more kind of like a selective environment rather than like more kind of like a heterogeneous environment of audience.
That's interesting. And so, as a user, would you say that in terms of interacting socially, but also trying to engage with more truthful content, would you rank Twitter or X as on top of that list?
So, I mean, if you look at this kind of like list of these 8 platforms, we find like platforms like LinkedIn has very high quality, but it's like a very selective environment. Nobody talks about, not many people talk about politics. We observe a platform like, Blue Sky has a very high quality content compared to X, for example. Platforms like Mastodon is also like on average quality is very high, particularly like for servers, platform, Mastodon has this kind of like distributed architecture of different servers. We look at like quality of content within Mastodon ecosystem. On average, the quality is very high because it has this federated architecture where like a server doesn't have a good moderation in place. Other servers would like suspend connection to that server. But in our analysis, Twitter X falls kind of in the middle in terms of the average quality, and then we have like LinkedIn, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as a better quality platform, and like alt tech platforms as a low quality platforms.
Interesting. Well, Professor, when you have the new insights on your research in the other platforms, I would love to host you again, and so you can share with us your insights. But from right now, I'm very honored to have you here. It was very insightful, and thank you for joining me, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.